The little girl said to the prince, "I don't want gold. I just want a hug and someone I can call Dad." The snow had come early that winter, laying its pale hands over the stone paths and timber roofs of Haviland like a quiet decree. Days passed in a hush, interrupted only by the sound of wood splitting behind the orphanage or the dull clank of buckets being filled at the well. Wind pressed against the windows, thin glass panes rattling in their warped frames, and the smell of wet wool and boiled potatoes clung to the air inside like a second skin. The orphanage sat at the edge of the village near the old churchyard, its walls gray with soot and age. It had once been a place of quiet dignity, when benefactors still sent coin or cloth or the occasional sack of coal. But that had been before the war in the East, before the noble houses lost interest in rural causes, and before names like Velkar stopped appearing on the donation ledgers altogether. In early December of 1897, just days before the feast of St. Nicholas, a letter arrived at the orphanage with the crest of the provincial ministry. Sister Emily broke the seal at the kitchen table, her hands rough and red from hours at the wash basin. Her lips moved silently as she read the words, her expression sharpening with every line. The letter was brief, perfunctory. Due to the collapse of private charitable funding and the growing burden on the state, several children from Haviland's orphanage would be subject to relocation. An institutional facility in Liberec, larger, colder, farther, was prepared to take those not suitable for adoption. No list of names had been included. That would come later, the ministry promised. By that evening, the news had seeped through the building like cold through a cracked window. Chores were done with less purpose, meals eaten in silence. The older boys paced the halls after curfew, muttering. The younger ones clung to one another, sensing without understanding that the ground beneath them had shifted. Even the babies cried more that night, as if they too felt the change in the air. In the shared girls' dormitory, where candles burned low and the stone walls exhaled chill into the bunks, Adela Hranachova sat upright on her mattress, arms wrapped around her knees. She had not cried. She had not asked questions. At 8 years old, she had already learned that questions were coins poorly spent in places like this. She was small, barely filling the narrow bed, and always quiet, so quiet that most forgot she was in the room until she moved. But her eyes missed little. And that evening, as she helped Lida fold laundry near the corridor that led to the rector's office, she heard something, barely a whisper, from behind the half-closed door. Sister Emily's voice, low and clipped, carried only a handful of words. They used to give generously, before the family fell. Velkar. Elena's scandal ruined the name. Velkar. Adela didn't blink. She folded a sheet slowly, her small fingers working the frayed linen, heart thrumming against her ribs. She knew that name. Or rather, she remembered hearing it spoken once, maybe twice, by a woman with dark eyes and a warm voice. It wasn't clear whether it had been a name, a place, or a story. But she remembered the way the word had curled around the room like a thread of perfume. She remembered the gold pin her mother had left behind. And she remembered the voice. Soft, close, saying something she'd never forgotten. You are loved. Never forget that. That night, after the others had drifted into sleep beneath patched quilts, Adela sat by the window in her shift, lit only by the yellow breath of a stubbed candle. Snow tapped softly against the glass. Her breath made small clouds. The brooch lay in her palm, tarnished, worn smooth at the edges, but unmistakable. A falcon etched in silver, wings spread wide, the crest of the Velkar family. She had never dared to speak of it to the others. It had been her secret, her story. And now, maybe, her answer. She took one of the schoolroom's writing books from under her bed and tore a clean sheet from the center. The ink froze twice in the bottle before she warmed it against her chest. Then she dipped the pen, hands steady despite the cold, and began to write. To Prince Tomasz Velkar. My name is Adela Hranachova. I live at the Haviland orphanage, but I think perhaps I used to live somewhere else. I have something that might belong to your family. A brooch with a falcon on it. It was given to me by my mother, or I think it was. She is gone now. I was very small when she left, and no one here knows her name. But I remember she said I was loved. I hope that is still true. If you are not my father, I understand. I do not want anything from you. I just thought maybe you would know something. About her, or about me. She signed it simply. Adela. Then she folded the letter around the brooch and tied it with the red ribbon from her hair. She left it on the corner of the kitchen table, near the stack of envelopes Sister Emily gathered each week. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't wait for an answer. The next morning, Sister Emily found the letter before the fire had been stoked. She recognized the brooch immediately. Her eyes scanned the page, pausing on the name. She sat down, slowly, and read the letter 3 times before folding it shut again. Her hands trembled slightly. She did not tell Adela she had found it. That afternoon, while the older children chopped wood and the younger ones practiced their catechism, Sister Emily bundled herself in her heavy wool habit and walked through the village, past the shuttered baker's and the grocer's with its fogged-up windows, past the rusted signpost that pointed toward the upper ridge. Her boots broke the snow with each step, the sound muffled by the wind as she climbed the path to the castle. Velkar Castle rose from the trees like a stone secret. Its towers were short now, worn down by years of neglect. The gates stood open but unwelcoming. No guards, no carriages, just a single smoking chimney and the low groan of a heavy wind. She knocked at the side entrance, and after a long silence, a servant let her in. She left the letter with him and did not wait for a response. Inside the castle, Tomasz Velkar sat in a room with faded maps strewn across his desk and unpaid bills in neat piles. The study smelled of ash and old tobacco. The fire had long since gone cold. He rubbed his temple with one hand and sipped at lukewarm tea, eyes fixed on the long list of estate debts that seemed to grow with every week. The letter arrived with the midday mail, stuffed between legal notices and a folded flyer from the ministry. He barely glanced at it until that evening, searching for a missing inventory sheet. He swept the stack aside and the ribbon slipped free. He opened the envelope absently, then stopped. The handwriting was small, uneven, the words simple, but clear. The brooch fell into his hand. For a long time, he didn't move. He knew this piece of jewelry, not as something that had passed through the house, not as a decoration worn by a guest. No, this brooch had a place, a history. He had watched his sister fasten it to her dress on the night she left the castle. He rose from the chair slowly, walked to the window, and pressed his hand to the cold glass. The pines outside stood stiff with ice, branches heavy with snow. The moon hung low behind them, pale and silent. He read the final line of the letter again. If you are not my father, I understand. His breath misted the pain. In the hush of that dim study, with the brooch clenched in his palm, one name echoed in his mind, soft, impossible, and unmistakable. Adela. The same name his sister had whispered the night she fled the estate. The snow deepened in Haviland, with a slow, relentless rhythm, falling in thick, unhurried flakes that muted the world beneath a coat of stillness. Forest paths vanished into drifts, and the narrow village streets became indistinguishable from the fields beyond them. Stone fences, once sharp and defined, now sloped under the weight of white. Roofs groaned beneath icicles, and windows wore halos of frost. The castle on the ridge, Velkar Castle, stood like a memory pressed into the hills. Its towers bore heavy crowns of snow, and its windows, few of them lit, seemed more like the eyes of a sleeping thing than a home. Inside, the hearths burned weakly, and the air clung to the chill of stone. But even with the wind pushing against the shutters and the silence echoing through the halls, something in the study was no longer still. Tomasz Velkar stood before the window, his hand resting on the wooden frame where frost had begun to feather inward. The letter from the girl lay on the desk behind him. The brooch sat in his pocket, its presence like a pulse against his coat. He hadn't left the castle in nearly 3 months, not since the last steward had resigned. The world below, the village, the church, the school, had drifted further and further away, until it seemed like another life entirely. But now, a thread pulled from the past had found him again, wrapped itself around his throat and chest, and refused to let go. He looked down at himself. His coat was wrinkled from disuse, the collar limp, his boots dusted with ash from pacing. He hadn't shaved in days. There were smudges of ink on his fingers, a stain of wax on his cuff. It didn't matter. He pulled on his overcoat, fastened it up to the throat, and stepped outside. The wind met him hard. He squinted into the white, then began his descent down the hill. The road was uneven, partially hidden beneath frozen snow, but his steps were steady. He told himself he was going into town for business, perhaps to speak with the magistrate about the estate's remaining taxes, or to inspect the market prices of wood and barley. He could say anything, to anyone, but the truth followed him as surely as his shadow stretched behind. He was going because of the girl, because of the name in the letter, because of the brooch that should have been lost to time. The walk to the village took longer than it used to. His legs ached in the cold, and his breath clouded in front of him like smoke. By the time he reached the edge of town, a fine dusting of snow clung to his shoulders and brimmed his coat sleeves. Children were already out with pails and buckets, lining up at the well near the church. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, disciplined streams. The town had learned to conserve, to stretch firewood and flour through a long winter. He passed the bakery, its shutters drawn, then the grocer's, where a woman swept snow from the stoop without lifting her gaze. No one greeted him. The name Velkar still held weight in Haviland, but not the kind it once did. Not the kind that opened doors. The orphanage came into view at the far end of the road, its walls dull and weary. The courtyard gate bowed under snow. He hesitated at the edge of the path. For a moment, he considered turning back. But his feet moved forward, as if summoned by the sound of a child's laughter. Sharp, sudden, and far too rare. He lifted the latch on the iron gate and stepped through. Sister Emily opened the door after only a few knocks. She wore her winter habit, a dark cloak wrapped tightly over her shoulders. Her mouth tensed when she saw him. "Prince Velkar," she said, not unkindly, but with a guarded note. "We weren't expecting you." He nodded once. "I'm here on estate matters," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I thought I'd observe the morning routines, see how the place fares." Her eyes searched his, not quite believing him, but not challenging him either. She stepped aside to let him in. Inside, the orphanage was warmer than he expected. A single hearth in the main room gave off enough heat to soften the chill, and the scent of broth lingered faintly in the air. Children's voices echoed faintly from the back courtyard, chopping wood, scrubbing buckets, filling baskets. He followed the sound. The courtyard was enclosed by a low stone wall and dusted with snow, packed down by small boots. The children moved about in 2s and 3s, assigned to their tasks. Some dragged firewood from the shed, others scrubbed windows with rags and warm water drawn from the stove. He stood by the back doorway, unnoticed. Then he saw her. She stood beside a stump, both hands gripped around a wooden-handled axe. A log sat in front of her, too wide for her reach, too heavy for her arms. Her coat barely reached her knees, and the sleeves were folded up to show red, raw wrists. Her hair, ash brown and knotted from wind, had come loose from its ribbon. Still, she raised the axe and brought it down with all the strength she had. It struck crooked and splintered the edge of the log. She paused, adjusted her stance, and lifted again. There was no complaint in her face, only concentration, and a kind of quiet resolve. He watched her from the doorway, the wind curling around his legs. Her posture struck something deep in him, the tilt of her head, the way she narrowed her eyes, the furrow at her brow. All of it, painfully familiar. He didn't speak to her. He didn't even move. Instead, he turned and left the way he came, walking through the gate without a word. The image followed him, seared into his thoughts. That expression, so like his sister's. By the time he reached the main road again, the snow had begun to fall more heavily. Wind blew against his collar, and his boots sank deeper with every step. His hands were numb inside his gloves, but he barely noticed. His mind spun, the rhythm of her movements repeating in his memory. The hill leading back to the castle rose before him like a challenge. He climbed steadily, breath labored, the brooch heavy in his pocket once again. The trees stood tall on either side of the path, bare and black against the white. The sky darkened prematurely as the afternoon waned. Halfway up the slope, he heard it, a sound behind him, soft but distinct, snow crunching beneath small feet. He stopped and turned. She stood 10 paces behind him, her breath coming in quick clouds, her cheeks flushed bright from the cold. Her coat was still too thin, the buttons misaligned. Her scarf was missing. Her gloves, if she'd ever had any, were gone. Her hands were red, knuckles scraped from the axe. For a long moment, neither moved. Then slowly she stepped forward and lifted her hand, not the one curled tight from the cold, but the other. From her fingers, resting on her small, chapped palm, hung the brooch. She didn't offer it. She didn't ask anything. She simply showed it to him, her eyes steady and searching. He looked at the brooch, then at her. Her face didn't change. She was not pleading. She was not afraid. She stood in the snow, coat open at the collar, and asked for nothing more than the truth. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. She looked past him up the hill. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "What's it like in the castle?" she asked. He hesitated, unsure how to answer. She nodded once, as if she didn't need one, and turned. Her small frame moved away from him, step by step, back down the hill, her boots sinking into the fresh snow, her trail already disappearing behind her. He watched her until the wind began to pick up again, and the flakes thickened, erasing her outline in the whiteness. When he finally reached the castle, the great wooden door groaned as he pushed it open. The hinges protested, and the warmth from the inner hall met him faintly. He stepped inside, the cold wrapped around his shoulders. But before he could close the door behind him, a voice rose from the white, carried through the wind like a memory. "I don't want gold. I just want a hug. And someone I can call Dad." The wind did not let up overnight. It scraped against the shutters of the study, groaning like an old man in his sleep. Inside, Tomáš Velkar sat hunched over his desk, the last embers of the fire crumbling behind him. His pen scratched faintly against parchment, dipped in ink so often that a smear now trailed beside every second word. The edges of the paper curled from the cold. He had not slept. Not truly. The few hours his eyes closed, his mind played the same image over and over. Adela, her coat thin, her small hand outstretched, the brooch gleaming like a relic of something lost. And then the words, still hanging in the air, still echoing through the empty halls of his thoughts. He straightened the parchment and reread the letter aloud in a low voice, more to hear it spoken than to check for errors. "To Sister Emily, I hope this message finds you well. I write to formally propose that the child, Adela Hranacheva, be permitted to stay at Velka Castle on a temporary basis. Given the current uncertainty surrounding the relocation of wards, I believe it may relieve some of the burden on the orphanage during this difficult season. Please consider this a gesture of goodwill and practical support, not a challenge to any authority or claim. She will be provided with shelter, nourishment, and appropriate supervision. I am prepared to assume temporary responsibility for her care until further decisions are made by the proper provincial channels. Respectfully, Tomáš Velkar." He paused, then folded the letter neatly, sealed it with wax, and called for the steward to deliver it by hand before the snow deepened again. The answer came the next afternoon. Sister Emily's reply was written in firm, deliberate script. She accepted the proposal, but not without terms. Adela was to be accompanied by Lida, the youngest of the staff women, barely older than a girl herself. Lida was dependable, quiet, and possessed the kind of gentleness that made her beloved by the children. Emily insisted she be allowed to stay at the castle throughout Adela's visit, not just as a chaperone, but as a safeguard. Tomasz agreed, without protest. By the week's end, the village was already stirring with rumors. They came like frost, creeping across window panes, slow, silent, and impossible to ignore. The reclusive prince had summoned a child to his castle. Why? Some said she was his illegitimate daughter. Others whispered of inheritance schemes, curses, penance. One man at the smithy swore he'd heard the girl was a distant noble from a disgraced branch of the family. A woman at the bakery murmured that it was grief, not guilt, that had moved the prince. Madness, not mercy. Tomasz let the stories circulate. He neither denied nor fed them. He kept to the castle, lighting the unused rooms himself, walking the corridors alone, watching the horizon for movement along the ridge road. The morning Adela arrived, sleet fell in sheets so fine they shimmered like silver needles against the slate sky. The wheels of the small carriage creaked over frozen ruts, the horses snorting against their bridles. Lida stepped out first, pulling her shawl close, and helped Adela down from the step. She stood at the edge of the courtyard, her boots damp from the ride, her face hidden beneath the hood of her brown cloak. She carried nothing but a satchel. The castle loomed above her, silent and weathered, its stones blackened by time and rain. The great oak doors remained closed. No bell rang. No servant stood waiting. Tomasz did not greet her. Lida, though quiet, guided her with a calm assurance. They entered through the side hall, past the unused ballroom, and into the old family wing. The air inside was dry, but no warmer than the wind outside. The hearths remained unlit. Only the faint scent of beeswax and old parchment filled the air. They ascended a narrow staircase. On the second floor, Lida opened a heavy wooden door with a rusted key and ushered Adela into a room that had not seen guests in years. The furniture was draped in white cloth, ghost-like and still. A single window let in light that dulled against the dust in the air. The wallpaper, once green with floral patterns, now peeled at the edges in yellowed strips. A small bed stood in the corner, its wooden frame carved with vines. Lida uncovered the mattress and laid fresh linens, unpacked Adela's single dress and cloak, and placed them in the wardrobe. The silence pressed in from every direction. Even the floorboards creaked reluctantly beneath their feet. Adela wandered to the window, fingertips trailing along the frosted sill. Beyond the glass, the garden lay buried in gray snow. The trees bent under ice, their branches like tired arms. She did not speak. In the days that followed, she continued to say little, but her presence lingered in the corners of the castle like smoke. She moved cautiously, walking the corridors like a guest unsure if she was welcome. She kept to the edges of the grand halls, where the carpets had worn thin, where the light from the stained glass fell in colorless shafts. Tomasz did not force conversation. They passed each other in silence, once on the staircase, again in the corridor outside the library. At meals, they sat at opposite ends of the long dining table. So far apart their voices would not have reached without effort. Still, he noticed things. She placed her shoes neatly by the entrance every night, always aligned, always clean of mud, just as his sister used to. She took her meals with composure, never asking for more, never wasting a crumb. And each evening, after Lida retired and the candles burned low, Adela lingered by the music room door, listening. Tomasz never touched the piano, but he did visit the library every night. Not to read, he rarely pulled a book from the shelves, but to sit near the hearth, the fire low, the walls lined with volumes that smelled of old wood and leather. Adela passed the door more than once. Each time her shadow flickered across the threshold. They never spoke directly, but the silence between them began to feel less like a wall and more like a rope stretched tight between two distant shores. For her part, Adela watched him. She saw the way he walked with shoulders slightly hunched, as if still expecting to carry weight he no longer bore. She noticed how his hands lingered over the stair railing when he paused, or how he stood still for long moments near the portrait at the top of the stairs, a painting of a young woman in a pale green dress, half smiling. She didn't need to be told who it was. She examined the halls with care. In one corner, she found a discarded pair of boots, their soles uneven with use. In another, an old chessboard still set with pieces mid-game, the dust on them disturbed, as if someone had recently traced their outlines. The castle was not abandoned. It was grieving. One afternoon, as the wind howled around the tower eaves, Adela stepped into the neglected garden behind the north wing. The snow was deeper here, untouched, and the fountain at its center was frozen solid. She knelt beside a flower bed where dead stalks still reached for the sky, brittle and black. She began clearing the snow with her gloved hands, brushing gently around the stone edging, not planting, not playing, just tending, as if something still lived beneath the ice. Lida watched from the hallway window and said nothing. A sound broke the air. A low rumble, the creak of wheels, the muffled stamp of hooves against packed snow. A carriage had arrived. Not the castle's. Not from the orphanage. It stopped at the front entrance, the driver stepping down to open the door. A tall figure emerged, wrapped in a long wool coat, the shoulders marked by the insignia of the provincial office. He carried a rolled parchment under one arm. Gregor Kovac. Tomasz, alerted by the steward, stepped out from the West Hall just as the official entered. The two men exchanged no pleasantries. Gregor's eyes swept the foyer, noting the state of the floors, the faded carpet, the tapestries that had not been dusted in weeks. He looked at Tomasz with a mixture of derision and formality. Then, drawing the scroll from his coat, he unrolled it slowly and spoke in a voice sharp enough to cut through stone. "This child," he said, "is not yours. And soon, neither will this castle be." Gregor Kovac's voice lingered in the corridor long after he had spoken, as if the stone walls were still considering the weight of his words. He stood with his shoulders squared, the rolled decree held like a blade beneath his arm. Behind him, the gray light from the courtyard framed his figure in harsh relief, casting long shadows into the entry hall. Tomasz said nothing at first. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing only slightly, but his posture remained unchanged. He had long since learned that men like Kovac fed on reaction. Instead, he reached for the edge of the parchment and unrolled it slowly. His eyes moved over the official wording, references to the Ministry of Orphaned and Displaced Youths, clauses from regional guardianship laws, and a clear warning regarding the unauthorized sheltering of a state ward. The implication was clear. By housing Adela without express permission from the provincial court, Tomasz risked both legal and financial penalties. More than that, it threatened the tenuous legitimacy of his role in her life. Kovac watched him read, the corners of his mouth twitching with something close to satisfaction. "I'm not here to remove her today," he added, as if granting a favor. "But I am obligated to inform you that any future complications will be recorded and acted upon." Tomasz looked up then. "Complications," he repeated quietly. Kovac nodded once, adjusting the fur collar of his coat. Claims of blood without documentation, custody without inquiry. One could call that theft, depending on the court's interpretation. He took a step back toward the door. Or perhaps just desperation. Either way, you understand the risk. With that, he turned and exited, his boots striking the stone in precise rhythm. Outside, the carriage door shut with a firm snap, and the driver flicked the reins. The wheels turned slowly through the slush, carving deep ruts in the snow as the sleet resumed its soft descent. Tomasz stood in the entryway, the document still in his hand. The draft from the open door swept past him, rustling the tapestries and lifting dust from the floorboards. He folded the parchment neatly and carried it to his study without a word. That evening, after the hearth had been lit and the castle settled once more into its quiet rhythm, he sat at his desk and wrote to Sister Emily. His handwriting was sharp, almost too deliberate, as though the precision could somehow anchor the uncertainty gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He asked only for clarification. He needed to know if there was any record, any birth certificate, any written name, any signature or sworn testimony that tied Adela to Elena Velkar. The response came by morning. Delivered in a sealed envelope by the same steward who had once brought the first letter, Emily's reply was brief and apologetic. There was no official record, she wrote. Only what had been whispered by one of the midwives at the time, now long deceased. A story passed down through caretakers and scribbled into the corners of personal journals. The brooch was the only piece of physical evidence. Everything else was memory. Tomasz read the letter twice. Then he folded it, placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, and turned the key. He did not call for Kovac. He did not send the girl away. Instead, he walked the length of the western corridor, pausing at the tall window that overlooked the stables. The sleet had turned to fine snow, dusting the stone walls and blanketing the brittle hedges. The wind whistled low through the cracks in the glass. He thought of Elena, his sister, her sudden disappearance, the final days before she left the castle, the secrets she carried with her like wounds. And then he thought of the girl in the upstairs room, of her silence, of the way she walked the halls as if listening for something just beyond the edge of hearing. The decision, for him, was already made. He would claim guardianship, temporarily, officially, quietly, until the courts made their ruling, until something more could be proven. He would not allow her to be taken from the castle. Upstairs, in the far wing that no longer received visitors, Adela wandered alone. She had waited until Lida had gone to fetch firewood, until the footsteps of the staff had faded into the stone below. Her shoes barely made a sound on the worn rugs as she moved past closed doors and faded portraits, guided not by certainty but by instinct. The air in this part of the castle was colder, the light dimmer. She could smell dust, dry wood, and something old, linen or parchment, she couldn't quite tell. Her fingers brushed the wall as she walked, pausing at each door before passing it. She stopped in front of one, narrower than the others, with peeling paint and a warped frame. The knob turned stiffly. Inside, the air was close, undisturbed. The room beyond was filled with shapes beneath white cloths, a piano, a standing mirror, a pair of high-backed chairs. One window stood half-covered, letting in a weak stream of light that cut across the room in a single bar. She stepped inside. The dust shifted beneath her feet. She crossed slowly to the far wall, where a large cloth hung from a frame. She reached up and peeled it back. The portrait beneath took her breath. A young woman stared back at her, painted in fine brushstrokes, her figure captured in soft, pale light. Her hair, the same ash-brown shade as Adela's, was swept back from her face and tied with a ribbon. Her eyes, gray, rimmed with blue, looked outward, with a kind of distant sadness. She wore a simple gown, the color faded in the painting, and her mouth was set in a half-smile that suggested she had been asked to pose, but not to feel. Adela stared at her for a long time. It wasn't just the hair, or the eyes. It was something else, something in the way the woman held herself, the slight tilt of the chin, the curve of the shoulders. She looked like someone who had learned to hold her breath while waiting. The frame was heavy, carved in gold leaf and dark wood. Adela stepped around it carefully, her fingers trailing along the back, and there, tucked into the panel, barely visible, was a slip of parchment. A sealed envelope, yellowed with age, its edges curling. The paper felt fragile, as though it might crumble at the wrong touch. She held it gently. On the front, in faded ink, was a single line of writing. To my daughter, Adela, if ever she should return. Her breath caught. She didn't open it. Not yet. She stood still, the envelope in her hand, heart pounding in her ears. After a moment, she turned and slipped it into the folds of her dress. Then she left the room and walked back to her chamber without a sound. That night, something in the castle shifted. The air seemed warmer, though no new fires had been lit. The halls felt less hollow. The portraits on the wall looked less like relics and more like witnesses. Even the floorboards, when they creaked, did so as if stretching awake from a long sleep. Tomasz walked the corridor as he often did before turning in, passing Adela's door just as her candlelight flickered beneath the threshold. He paused, his hand resting briefly on the frame. He didn't knock, but something intangible, some ripple in the stillness, told him the girl inside had found something important, and that whatever wall had stood between them was beginning to fade. Neither of them spoke that night, but they both knew something had changed. The next morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the sky clear and pale as bone. Tomasz rose early and walked to the library, a wool shawl thrown over his shoulders. The fire had not yet been lit, and the cold clung to the spines of the books. He crossed to the far shelf, where the family records were kept, ledgers and Bibles and birth registers. He pulled down the old Velkar family Bible, its leather cover cracked at the corners, and opened it on the desk beside the frosted window. He turned past the first pages, inscriptions in Latin, genealogy in neat lines, until he reached the back margin, where names had once been added by hand. His eyes moved slowly. There, scratched faintly into the parchment in a hurried, uneven scrawl, was a single name, Adela, 1889. He stared at it in silence as the first bell rang out from the church tower across the valley. The church bell echoed faintly across the hills, its sound carried on the thin morning air. Inside the library, Tomasz remained still, his fingers resting on the brittle edge of the family Bible. The name stared up at him from the faded page, scratched, not penned, the ink barely clinging to the parchment. Adela, 1889. It wasn't a birth record. It wasn't notarized. There was no date of baptism, no mother's name beside it, just a name in the margin. But it was her name, and the year matched. The scrawl was rushed, but familiar. He had seen his sister write in that exact way when hurried or anxious, always tilting slightly to the right, letters slanting into one another as if trying to hide. He turned away from the desk, the cold of the room settling deeper into his coat. The fire had died long ago, and the light creeping through the window panes had lost its warmth. He crossed the room slowly, his boots quiet on the rug, and left the Bible open on the table behind him. Something inside him had shifted. Not a revelation, not yet, but something close. He made his way back to the portrait room before speaking to anyone. The long hallway groaned under his steps, the castle still waking in the grip of a late winter morning. When he opened the door, the dust had settled again, light brushing the shape of the piano and the unused chairs like a veil. He approached the portrait with care this time, letting his gaze rest fully on the woman it depicted. Elena, his sister. She looked younger here than in his last memories of her. The artist had captured the lightness of her cheekbones, the quiet edge of mischief in her half-smile. She wore the green ribbon she favored in her youth, but it was the eyes that held him. Gray, thoughtful, tinged with sorrow. The same eyes Adela carried now. He didn't touch the frame. He only stood there, long enough for the silence to wrap around him like a question he couldn't answer. He remembered the final days of her time at Velkar Castle. How withdrawn she'd become. How quickly she'd turned from society. She'd stopped attending evening dinners, spent hours walking alone by the woods, taken to carrying folded letters she refused to let him read. And then, one night, she vanished. No explanation, no farewell, only the brooch left behind. Until now. He left the portrait room with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The law demanded documentation. He had none. But his instincts, sharpened by grief, silence, and time, told him the truth was standing in his halls. That afternoon he found Adela near the hearth in the great hall, seated cross-legged beside a stack of kindling. She was watching the logs, head tilted, as if listening for a secret hidden in the flames. He approached quietly and crouched beside her, rolling up his sleeves. "Watch," he said. She did. He showed her how to arrange the logs, smaller sticks at the base, how to check for dampness by tapping them against the floor and listening for the dull thud. He struck the flint, shielding the spark with one hand until the kindling caught, glowing like a hidden sun. Together, they fed the fire, waiting as the orange flickers stretched higher into the chimney's stone mouth. She said nothing until it was burning steady. He rose, brushing his hands off on his coat, and watched as she placed a small, half-scorched twig upright in the ash like a flag. Later that week, he led her through the iron gate that separated the courtyard from the outer wall. The snow was thinning along the stone path, though frost still clung to the trees. He pointed to the carving etched in the wrought iron crest mounted over the gate's arch. "Do you see the falcon?" he asked. She nodded. "That's the Velkar crest. We were given it long before this place was built. It's been changed over the years, but the wings always remain." She traced the curve of the metal with her fingers. He didn't say more. He didn't have to. One morning, during her Latin lesson, he corrected her gently, showing her how to pronounce Calum without dropping the second syllable. When she repeated it back, he smiled, without meaning to. "Well done, little one," he said. The words slipped out before he realized they'd formed. Adela didn't look up. She only turned the page and continued reading, her lips pressed together, but a quiet brightness warmed the edges of her expression, like sunlight beneath frost. The castle grew less quiet after that. Not louder, just less hollow. The hearths were lit earlier. Lida hummed while sweeping. The horses stirred in the stable with less restlessness. But outside the walls, the winds were shifting. Gregor Kovac, displeased by the lack of response to his decree, had begun the work of removal in earnest. With ties to the provincial office, he drafted a formal petition, citing legal precedent and moral concern. He labeled Tomasz an unfit guardian, an unmarried, isolated noble with no proven blood relation, no recent public appearances, and a history of disgrace. He positioned the matter as one of legal hygiene. No politics, no cruelty, just order. The petition moved quickly through the necessary desks. He had friends in the right chairs. When the courier arrived at the castle gates, the horses were still steaming from the climb. The envelope bore the mark of the district court, the seal pressed deep into the wax. It was delivered into Tomasz's hands without ceremony. He opened it in the study, his thumb tearing the edge cleanly. The document was brief. 48 hours. That was the time allotted to bring Adela before the court in Haviland for review. Failure to comply would result in penalties, seizure of property, and the immediate removal of the child to state custody. He reread the letter once, then folded it with care and placed it on the mantel. Lida found out before he told her. The kitchen maid had seen the courier at the gate and whispered the news before supper. She began packing immediately, quietly, quickly, filling a small trunk with Adela's things while pretending not to look worried. Her hands moved with purpose, but her shoulders were tight. When Tomasz entered the room, she stood still. "Don't," he said. She nodded once, but left the bag by the door. Adela didn't cry. She didn't pack. She didn't ask questions. She went outside. The garden was still mostly covered in snow, though patches of ground were showing through. The statue of Elena Velkar stood at the edge of the courtyard, its shoulders dusted in frost, its face tilted downward in eternal contemplation. Adela sat on the cold stone bench before it, coat wrapped tight, scarf hanging loose around her neck. Her boots were damp, her gloves missing. She stared up at the statue with unreadable eyes. No one approached her. The castle was too quiet to disturb what she was feeling. The afternoon passed slowly. Light faded into a dull gold behind the mountains. The scent of smoke drifted from the chimney. Inside, the hallways seemed to listen more than they echoed. A restlessness clung to the air, like something was waiting to break. That night, the castle didn't sleep. Tomasz walked the length of the upstairs corridor several times. each pass bringing him to the door of Adela's room. Each time he paused. Each time he said nothing. Inside, the candle burned low on the table. Adela sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, the envelope from the portrait held in her hands. She hadn't opened it. Not when she found it. Not since. But now, with the letter from the court pressed like a shadow against her days, she unfolded the brittle parchment and broke the seal. The ink had faded, but the words were still there. Looped handwriting that trembled at the ends, a voice trying to reach across years. As the hour grew late, Tomasz stood outside her door, unable to knock, unable to speak. Behind it, Adela read the letter from her mother for the first time and began to cry. The air inside Velka Castle held still, as if even the walls knew what was coming. Every room, parlor, corridor, bedroom, carried the hush of something waiting to break. There were no echoes now, only the faintest creaks of old timber shifting in the cold and the hollow thud of footfalls softened by thick carpets. The quiet had shape and weight. It was the silence that comes not with peace, but with dread. Outside, the sky hung low, as though the snow had pressed down upon it. The wind had calmed, but flakes still drifted slowly, lazily, coating the courtyard in a fresh layer. The kind of snow that fell without urgency, as if the world had nothing left to do but watch. Inside, Lida knelt beside Adela's narrow bed and packed in slow, careful motions. She folded a single blue dress, one woolen sweater, and 2 pairs of stockings. A worn storybook with a faded cover. A brush with missing bristles. She wrapped each item in brown paper, tying the bundle with string before setting it in the small trunk Sister Emily had sent with her when they arrived. It was hardly large enough for a week's worth of things, but it wasn't the size that bothered her. It was the fact that she had to pack it all. Across the room, Adela sat in silence, watching without blinking. She did not cry. She did not argue. But her hands stayed clenched around the edge of the mattress, knuckles pale. Tomasz hadn't spoken much since the summons arrived 2 days ago. He hadn't made a speech or offered reassurances. He hadn't told her not to be afraid. But his eyes had changed. They held something now that hadn't been there before. Not panic, but wait. And the way he walked through the halls made it clear that he was chasing time that refused to slow. As the light dimmed outside, candles were lit throughout the castle. Wax pooled at the base of the sconces, and the scent of tallow settled into the tapestries. In the drawing room, the table had been set for 3, though only 2 would sit to eat. The silverware was mismatched, the napkins softened from years of use. The meal itself was modest: potatoes, cabbage, and a heel of dark bread sliced in careful portions. No wine, only water. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shifting shadows across the tall walls. Adela sat at one end of the table, Tomasz at the other. The distance between them felt longer than the table itself, longer than the room. They ate in silence, chewing slowly, politely. The scrape of utensils against porcelain filled the gaps where words should have been. Outside the tall windows, snow fell again, quietly, thickly, layering the terrace and cloaking the garden paths. No one spoke of the court or the carriage that would come. No one spoke of what would happen after. When the plates were cleared and Lida had retired to the kitchen, Tomasz stood without a word and gestured for Adela to follow him. She rose, her chair legs groaning softly against the stone, and walked beside him. They passed through the west hall and into the music room. It had not been used properly in years, though the air inside still carried the faint, distant scent of polish and dust. The room was warmer than the others, thanks to the fireplace Lida had lit earlier. The grand piano stood in its usual place beneath the portrait of Elena, uncovered now, watching them from above with her eternal half-smile. Tomasz stepped to the piano and ran his hand gently over the keys. He paused, then sat. The bench creaked under his weight. For a long moment, he did nothing, only stared at the ivory keys, as if they might answer the questions he couldn't speak aloud. Then he began to play. The melody was simple, halting at first, a child's lullaby composed of only a few repeated notes. His fingers trembled as they moved, not from age or cold, but from memory. He had not played since before Elena left, perhaps not since they were children. Adela stood beside him, her hands clasped in front of her, watching. He played through once, then again. On the third time, she sat beside him and rested her head lightly against his arm. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. For that small window of time, the castle no longer felt like a place waiting to mourn. The fire glowed with real warmth. The room felt lived in, whole. And the portrait above the piano seemed to soften, as though even Elena could feel the shift. When the last note faded, Adela didn't ask about the court, or the mourning, or the men who would come. She only said, "Will you play it again?" Tomasz nodded and lifted his hands. Later, when the candles burned low and Lida had gone to bed, Tomasz sat alone in the library, a wool blanket over his legs and a single lamp burning beside him. The court order lay open on the desk. 48 hours. By morning, that window would close. He stared at the paper, then at the fire, then back at the dark window where the snow pressed thick against the glass. He had no documents, no legal standing, no power that mattered. But he had seen her eyes. He had heard her voice. He had touched the brooch and seen the name etched into the Bible's margin. He had heard Elena's name in every quiet moment that passed between them. He had no plan. But he had decided. He would not let her be taken. The castle lay still around him. The fire burned down to its last logs. He closed his eyes. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the trees, the stables, the drive. Wind hissed along the shutters, but the storm itself was soft, patient. Just before midnight, the iron gates creaked open. The sound was low, drawn out, nearly lost in the howl of the wind. A carriage entered the courtyard. No lanterns, no trumpeted arrival. It rolled quietly across the stones, its wheels crunching through fresh snow, then halted near the servants' entrance. Several figures stepped down. None wore uniforms, but their posture, their silence, marked them clearly. Men of order. Men bearing a purpose sanctioned from above. They didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. They moved with practiced efficiency, slipping through the rear corridor like shadows. Their boots left no marks. Their orders were in hand, signed, sealed, backed by the weight of the provincial court. In her room, Adela stirred only when the door opened. A man stepped inside, his expression unreadable, his coat still wet from snow. He crossed to her bed and spoke in a voice so low it felt more like air than words. She blinked, sat up, confused at first, then frightened, then silent. He helped her into her coat, wrapped her blanket around her shoulders. Lida heard the creaking in the floorboards just as she was setting kindling in the kitchen hearth. She ran, barefoot, apron flying behind her, through the corridor to the back hall. One of the men caught her by the arm. "You can't," she started. But he raised a hand and pointed to the paper he carried. She looked at it, but didn't read. She tried again to move past, but the grip on her arm tightened. They passed her carrying Adela, her head resting on the shoulder of the man who held her. Her eyes were open, but she didn't struggle. They walked through the snow, boots silent, breath misting in the moonlight. The cart was waiting. Its wheels had been muffled. Its horses stood still. The door closed with a soft thud, and then they were gone. Tomasz woke to silence. Something had pulled him from sleep. Some shift in the air, some wrongness in the stillness. He stood quickly, heart pounding, and moved through the halls in his slippers, not bothering with a coat. He reached the front door and flung it open. Cold air struck his chest. Snow whipped across his face. At the edge of the woods, barely visible between the trees, he saw the back of the carriage as it vanished into darkness. He stepped outside, feet sinking into the powder, breath sharp in his throat. The wind swept the path clean behind it. All that remained in the snow was one small handprint left on the stone steps. The light that crept over the hills the next morning was pale and merciless. Snow blanketed everything, roof tiles, branches, cobblestones, rendering the landscape cold and weightless. The trees along the road to the village stood still in their winter coats, as if watching, as if bracing for something. Tomasz hadn't slept. The fire in the library had burned out hours ago, and the chill in his chest hadn't eased since the moment he stepped barefoot into the snow the night before. That handprint on the step, small, perfect, and already beginning to blur, remained in his mind like a wound. He had dressed before the sun rose, moving with urgency, but not chaos. Each motion had weight. Every button fastened was a step toward resolve. He pulled on his overcoat, tied the scarf Lida had left at the foot of the stairs, and stepped outside with the wind clawing at his collar. The walk to the orphanage cut through the village square. The road was mostly untouched, the snow still soft from the night storm, but the footprints of the guards and the cart had not yet faded. As he passed the shuttered homes and dim shops, a few early risers peered from their windows. No one waved, no one called out. The iron gate at the orphanage was ajar when he arrived. He pushed through it and strode up the path, not pausing to knock. The door creaked open under his hand. Inside, the air smelled of boiled oats and wood smoke. Children's voices murmured from distant rooms, muffled behind thick doors. He found Sister Emily in the front parlor, bent over the stove, stirring a small pot. She looked up as he entered. She didn't ask why he was there. "They took her," he said. "I know," she replied. "You let them." "I didn't have a choice." He stepped closer, fists clenched at his sides. "You could have warned me. I only learned hours before." Her voice was steady but tired. Kovac submitted the paperwork directly to the ministry in Prague, not the provincial court here. There was no opportunity to appeal. His jaw worked, but no sound came. "She's being relocated," Emily continued, setting the spoon down with deliberate care. "To Liberec. It's already done. The train departs tomorrow at dawn. Once she's registered, she'll be assigned to the state institution there. She'll be lost." "She'll be numbered," Emily said. "That's not the same thing, but it's close." He turned toward the door. "Without documentation, there's nothing we can do," she called after him. "No blood record, no guardianship. They'll never listen to an old story and a brooch." But he was already gone. Back at the castle, snow clung to the edges of the courtyard like a warning. The walls loomed in silence as Tomasz moved from room to room, searching. He opened drawers and trunks that had remained locked for years. He pulled linens from closets, books from shelves, letters from boxes yellowed by time and air. He moved through Elena's old quarters with care, unearthing journals with water-damaged pages, correspondence with distant cousins, snippets of poetry written in margins. Each item a thread, but no pattern. In the library, he opened the cabinet behind the fireplace and pulled down a stack of ledgers wrapped in twine. Some bore the family crest. Others were blank. He spread them across the table and searched page by page for a name, a date, anything to tie Eleanor to the child they had taken. He found mentions of travel, trips to spa towns, doctors visited, a single note in the corner of a guest book. Eleanor, summer 1889, S. Border Village, name withheld. It wasn't enough. He kept digging. It was nearly noon when Lida entered the main hall, snow in her hair, cheeks flushed from the cold. "There's more in the servants' quarters," she said. "Boxes that haven't been touched since the fire in the east wing. Some of them belong to the nurse who used to care for the lady." They searched together side by side, opening soot-blackened crates and water-stained trunks. The smell of ash and mildew clung to the air, but neither of them flinched. In the bottom of a wooden chest, beneath a broken lantern and several moth-eaten shawls, Lida uncovered a bundle of letters, tied in blue ribbon. The paper was delicate, crumbling at the edges. Tomasz took them gently, squinting at the faded script. They were addressed to a midwife, the handwriting unmistakably Eleanor's. The dates, late 1888, through early 1889. He sat on the floor, back against the stone wall, and read in silence. She wrote of fear, of shame, of the need to leave. She mentioned the Velkar name only once in the first letter. After that, she used only her given name. In the final note, she described her departure from Havlin, her arrival at a village near the southern border, and her intention to take on another name to avoid scandal. The child was due within the month. There was no mention of the father, no claim of legitimacy, but it was enough. He gathered the letters, the guest book entry, the notes from Elena's journal, and the original court summons. He laid them out on the study desk and packed them carefully into a leather satchel. The clasp clicked shut with a finality that sounded louder than it should have. He called for the coachman. "Ready the carriage," he said. "We leave within the hour." Lida appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. "You're going after her." He met her gaze. "You don't have to come." "I know," she said, "but I am." By late afternoon, the wind had picked up again. Flurries drifted across the valley like threads torn from the clouds. The horses were restless, their breath steaming into the air, the sound of hooves stamping the stone courtyard echoing off the outer walls. The coachman loaded the satchel beside the driver's seat and threw extra blankets into the back. Just as Tomasz stepped into the carriage, the front gate opened. 3 villagers stood outside. An old man with a walking stick held out a wrapped loaf. A woman offered a sealed envelope with a statement inside. She had seen the men take the girl from the servant's wing. Another man, young and trembling, gave them his name and address, promising to tell the court what he had witnessed, if anyone would ask. Tomasz accepted the gifts silently, nodding once to each. They rode down the path as the sun slipped behind the ridge, the light gold and tired. The roads beyond Havlin were narrow, twisting, and coated with ice beneath the snow. The carriage wheels slid on the inclines, and more than once the horses balked on the turns. Lida held tight to the frame, her gloved hands bracing each time the carriage lurched. They said little. Tomasz held the satchel on his lap like a shield. The journey was slow. Trees bent inward above them, weighed down with snow. Frozen ruts rattled the wheels. Night fell quickly, and by the time they reached the last stretch of road before the Havlin station, the lanterns on the carriage had begun to flicker low. In the distance, beyond the trees, a long, low whistle echoed through the forest. The train was preparing to depart. The carriage rocked violently as it crested the ridge, snow and gravel sliding beneath the wheels with each turn. Hooves pounded against the icy road, and the horses pulled harder as the station's red roof came into view through the veil of white. The first trail of smoke from the locomotive wound into the air, grey against the frozen trees. The whistle had already sounded once. Tomasz gripped the edge of the door with one hand, the satchel of documents held tight in the other. His heart beat with a weight that felt unbearable, every second feeding his fear that he was already too late. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the edge of the station platform, urging the driver without words to go faster. The horses neighed and pulled as the carriage came off the final bend, and then the wheels hit packed snow. With a jolt and a violent skid, the carriage came to a halt outside the station. The horses stamped and tossed their heads, steaming breath clouding the air. Tomasz leapt down before the wheels stopped moving. He ran, boots crunching over snow and half-frozen slush, across the narrow courtyard and onto the platform. His breath came hard and fast, the cold biting at his throat as the low sound of the train's engine thrummed beneath his feet. The station, though modest, was crowded. Travelers hunched beneath scarves and shawls. Mothers called out to children. Suitcases and wooden crates lined the platform's edge. Officials in dark coats stood posted at the car doors, clipboards in hand. He pushed through the crowd, and for a moment, no one recognized him. Then someone whispered, "Prince Velkar." Heads turned. Faces emerged from beneath hats and hoods. Murmurs rippled through the line of passengers like wind through bare trees. He didn't stop. One of the uniformed officials stepped forward. "Sir, you'll need to—" Tomasz raised his voice. "My name is Tomasz Velkar," he called out. This child has been taken from my home under false pretenses. I demand this train be held. The station fell quieter, just enough for the word Velkar to land with weight. More heads turned. Several travelers stepped aside, giving him space. The official tried again. You're not permitted to... She is my niece, Tomasz said, louder now, raising the satchel over his shoulder. I have evidence. Documents, letters, records. This is not about title or rank. It is about what is right. Across the platform, a sharp voice cut through the silence. Your Highness, Gregor Kovac called, stepping from the far end of the train. His coat bore the insignia of the provincial office, and in his hand he carried a leather-bound file, its seal already broken. This child is a ward of the state, and this matter has already been decided. You are disrupting a lawful transfer. Tomasz turned toward him, face flushed, chest rising and falling with every breath. You knew, he said. You knew exactly who she was, and you took her anyway. I acted under the authority of the ministry in Prague. You, sir, have no legal standing. I have her mother's words. Tomasz stepped forward, pulling papers from the satchel. I have letters from Elena Velkar, dated during the time of her pregnancy. I have midwife correspondence. I have a guest book entry with her name and location. The crowd pressed in. The station master had come out of his office now, along with two minor clerks who were watching nervously from beneath the eaves. Tomasz held up the papers, reading aloud. Elena Velkar, 1889. I am leaving Havlin. I carry my child beneath my name, though I must give her none. She will be born where no one knows me. But one day, she must return. He opened another letter. She wrote to a midwife. She feared the disgrace. She feared for the child. And when she left her daughter behind. He opened the last paper and turned to the crowd. This girl is not a stray. She is not a state number. She is my blood. Kovac stepped forward again, his tone clipped. This is emotional theater. Nothing here constitutes a legal claim. You are appealing to sentiment, not law. Tomasz looked at him, then slowly extended his hand. Lida, he said softly. She stepped out from the crowd beside him, eyes glistening, and reached into her coat. From the folds, she withdrew a creased envelope, the one retrieved from Adela's bed, the seal still cracked open. She left this for her daughter, Lida said, voice trembling. Tomasz took it and unfolded the paper. He did not read it all, only the final lines. To my daughter, Adela, if ever she should find this, I pray one day you will walk the halls I once called home, that someone there will recognize your name, that someone there will stay. He stopped. The murmurs in the crowd stilled. The clerks looked to each other. The station master stepped closer, now uncertain. Even the official at the car door faltered in his stance. The train whistle blew again, louder now, insistent. Kovac, stone-faced, raised his voice. This has no authority. The documents are unverified. We must proceed. Tomasz turned from him and ran alongside the train. The wheels creaked and shifted as the engine prepared to roll. He peered into each window, eyes searching, passing compartment after compartment. Then, near the final car, he saw her. Adela. She sat by the window, coat buttoned to her chin, the edges of her scarf trailing across her lap. Her face was turned toward the glass, her eyes wide. When she saw him, her body went rigid, then rose. The crowd behind him blurred. All that remained was the window. He banged on the door. Adela! Inside, she turned fully toward him, eyes locked to his. The conductor raised a hand to wave passengers aboard. The platform shifted with motion. Tomasz pounded the door again. Open it! Inside, she stepped forward, reaching the door, her hand hovering over the latch. Her face was pale, but she did not look away. The train's engine hissed, steam curling around the wheels. Then the door creaked open. Adela stepped forward, her boots touching the platform, but she said nothing. She stood still, waiting. Tomasz stood before her, breathless, and the final moment hung in the air. She would not move until he gave her the words he'd never dared to say. The platform, held its breath. Tomasz stood motionless before the open train door, the wind tugging at his coat, his breath still fast from the run. Adela stood just beyond the threshold, one foot on the wooden platform, the other still inside the carriage. She looked up at him, her face unreadable, her hands clenched at her sides. Around them, the crowd had fallen into a quiet hush. No more murmurs, no more judgment, only a silent, collective waiting. He saw it then, not just the child she was, but the life she had carried without complaint, her silence, her calm. The questions she had never asked, because no one had given her permission to believe in answers. She was waiting for the one thing she had never received from anyone, not a gift, not even a promise, but something much simpler, a place to belong. He stepped forward, his voice steady, though he had no need to speak. He opened his arms and embraced her. Adela pressed her face against his coat, her fingers gripping the fabric as though she meant to hold it closed around her. She said nothing. Neither did he. The moment didn't call for words. Around them, the officials lowered their eyes. The passengers stopped shifting in place. Even the station master, who had held his breath when Tomasz first arrived, now stood with his hands folded behind his back, nodding once to the court clerks. Kovac stepped forward, jaw clenched, the veins in his neck tight with frustration. But when he opened his mouth to speak, one of the clerks raised a hand, stopping him before the first syllable could form. "There's been enough said," the clerk said simply. Kovac faltered, his grip tightening on his case file. But the crowd had turned. No one was listening to him now. The tide had shifted. No decree from Prague, no signature of authority, could change the truth that had just unfolded in front of them. He turned away without another word. By midday, the whistle of the train had long faded into the hills. The last of the officials remained only to ensure that the matter was resolved legally and properly. One of them, a middle-aged clerk from Liberec with ink-stained hands and a nervous gait, arrived with haste after receiving the telegram Lida had sent earlier that morning. He was polite but cautious, clearly aware that he was stepping into a situation far larger than he had expected. He reviewed the satchel of documents carefully, checking each against the dates in the provincial ledger. He listened as Lida explained how the letter from Elena had been found. He took testimony from 2 villagers who had followed Tomasz back to the station to speak for what they had seen. He asked questions, many of them, and wrote his notes in a small bound book, pausing often to think. But by the time the sun moved behind the treetops, the clerk closed the book, sighed, and stood. "This is irregular," he admitted, "but it's not unfounded. The girl may remain under your care until the court finalizes the ruling." Tomasz nodded, not with triumph, but with something closer to relief. The clerk tipped his hat, already scribbling instructions for the local magistrate. "There won't be a challenge. I'll see to it myself." The return to Velkar Castle was quiet. No bells, no procession. Just the sound of wheels over packed snow and the horse's breath rising in slow rhythm. The shadows had grown long by the time they reached the crest of the hill, the sky glowing faintly with the colors of late winter dusk. Adela did not ask if it was truly hers now. She did not need to. She carried no trunk. Lida had gathered her things earlier and placed them in the small room beside the library. But Adela did not return to that room. She went instead to the one where she had found the portrait, where the wallpaper still peeled slightly near the window, where the light in the morning hit the wooden floor in long slants. She placed her brush on the desk, her drawings on the wall, the letter from her mother beneath her pillow. She did not unpack. She settled in, and the castle responded. The air inside began to change. Hearths were lit earlier. The smell of stew drifted from the kitchen long before supper. Fresh kindling was stacked in the corners of the hallways. The great hall, long dark and silent, came alive again with footsteps, with voices, with the echo of laughter. Tomasz moved through the estate with purpose, though not as a nobleman. He took to repairs himself, patching a leaking window, straightening a sagging shelf. He stopped by the stables each morning. He spoke with the steward about the next planting. It was not about reclaiming pride or land. It was about rhythm, about presence, about building something that could hold. He found himself listening more than speaking. He found himself learning to be still in a room with Adela and simply let it be enough. She drew more now. Not only flowers and birds, but people. She drew the great oak at the edge of the courtyard with a small figure beneath it. She drew the castle's front gate, the falcon crest on its iron curve. She drew the garden, not as it was, but as she imagined it could be. Lida, her hands finally free of ash and laundry, submitted her application for a teaching post in Prague. Tomáš helped her write the reference letter. He sat beside her at the long table in the drawing room and read the words aloud as she listened, unsure whether to smile or cry. Sister Emily visited in the early days of spring, when the snow began to recede and the first signs of thaw reached the edges of the woods. She walked the garden slowly, her cane tapping the path in a steady rhythm. When she passed the statue of Eleanor, she paused, her eyes moving over the stone face before looking toward Adela, who stood watching from beneath the eaves. "I remember your mother," she said quietly. "You carry her better than any name." For the first time in months, Emily smiled. Tomáš never returned to court. He never reclaimed his title. He stopped attending the assemblies in the provincial capital. The papers in Liberec still listed him as a dormant nobleman, neither active nor entirely gone. But none of that mattered. What he had reclaimed was not honor or recognition. It was something far more delicate, more stubborn. He had reclaimed the right to stay. One evening, as dusk fell and the fire in the great hall burned low, Adela stood near the hearth with a small wooden frame in her hands. Inside it, cradled beneath glass, was the brooch her mother had given her. The falcon, its wings spread. She climbed the step-stool and hung it above the mantel. Beneath it, carved carefully into the wood with the smallest of tools, were the words she had chosen herself. "So no one forgets how we got here." A full year had passed since the night Adela stepped off the train and back onto the frozen platform, since Tomáš spoke the words he had never dared say, and since a handprint in the snow changed the course of both their lives. Velkar Castle no longer stood in silence. The whispers had quieted. The corridors, once thick with cold air and old memories, were now filled with the quiet sounds of life. Footsteps, children's laughter, the scrape of a broom, the creak of a window being opened. The groan of the front gate in the morning, not from disuse but from daily welcome. It had not happened all at once. There had been no grand announcement, no banners hung. The transformation had come slowly, through small gestures repeated each day until they became routine. Tomáš had begun by repairing the servants' quarters, then the unused west wing. A stove was brought into the schoolroom. Mattresses were unrolled. Beds were built. The doors opened quietly, one child at a time. Sister Emily helped, her presence steady and tireless. She arrived with ledgers tucked beneath her cloak, names scribbled in careful columns, orphans who had no more space in their city shelters, children whose records had gone missing, children with no papers, but full names whispered into the dark by mothers they would never know. Some arrived alone, some in twos, a few too young to speak. But the castle held them. What had once been a noble estate had become a haven, not a home of royalty, but of refuge. Adela moved among them like a quiet guardian. She did not act older than her years, but she carried herself with an unspoken awareness, as if she remembered even in her joy what it meant to not belong. The other children noticed. They listened when she spoke. They shared their things with her, not out of obligation, but because they understood she had once shared nothing. In the village below, the change had not gone unnoticed. At first, there was hesitancy. Suspicion clung to old habits, but over time, when the people saw the children walking into town with woven baskets, helping at the church, learning their letters, they stopped looking at the castle as a shadow and began seeing it as something else entirely. By midsummer, A few villagers began sending extra loaves of bread, a basket of apples, then a set of books, worn but cherished. One morning, a man arrived with a wooden cart full of seedlings. No words, just a nod. The fields around the castle, once brittle and dark with frost, began to green. Winter herbs grew thick along the garden wall. The old vineyard was cleared of its tangles. The soil, no longer neglected, yielded modest crops. The castle's pantry slowly refilled, not by gold, but by hands. Tomasz changed too. His posture had straightened, not by effort, but by habit. The weight that once pulled his shoulders down had loosened its grip. He no longer moved like a man trying to disappear. He moved like a man returning, each day, to a purpose he hadn't known he was waiting for. He did not call himself father. He did not seek to be anyone's replacement. But he stayed. He rose early, walked the gardens, split firewood. He led lessons in history, read aloud during afternoon gatherings in the courtyard, helped repair broken shutters, and when a child cried in the night, he rose without hesitation to find them. In the afternoons, when the sky turned gold and the wind drifted through the cypress trees, he would sit by the fountain and read from one of the old books in the library. Adela would be there, a few feet away, her legs folded beneath her, scribbling into a leather-bound notebook with a quill she refused to trade for anything newer. Lida had given it to her before leaving for Prague. She called it her storybook. She filled it slowly, line by line, page by page. When asked what it was about, she would always shrug. "It's fiction," she said. But everyone who knew her knew better. She wrote about a girl in a falling-down castle, about a man who had once lost his voice but found it again in the silence, about names that weren't remembered but still mattered. She never let anyone read the ending. The days shortened again. Autumn came and left behind a hush of early frost. The trees in the lower orchard turned silver at the edges. In the kitchen, the fire never went out. The castle had learned to live not by pushing away the past, but by allowing it to walk alongside the present. And then, on a day just like the one a year before, snow began to fall again. Soft at first, barely brushing the window panes. Then thicker, swirling into the spaces between roof tiles, dusting the courtyard, lining the hedges with white. Adela finished writing the last sentence of her story. She set the quill down, pressed her palm against the page for a moment, and then stood. She ran through the halls, her laughter skipping ahead of her, her voice calling back over her shoulder. Her boots echoed on the stone floors, down the main corridor, past the stairwell, into the drawing room where Tomasz sat with his glasses resting low on his nose, a book open in his lap. She didn't stop. "Come on," she called. "You have to see it." He looked up, eyebrows raised, setting the book aside. She didn't wait. She darted through the door, coat already in her arms, scarf trailing behind her like a ribbon in flight. He stood, slower, his knees stiff from the cold. His coat hung on the hook beside hers. He pulled it on, smiling, and followed her out the same door, his pace quickening. Outside, in the garden, snowflakes caught in her hair. She turned to him, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with something larger than joy. "Come on, Dad," she said. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the story? Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like to show your support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotions and life lessons. And before we say goodbye, we'd like to remind you that on the end screen, you'll see a recommendation for another exciting and charming story. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.